He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora. Hey there, podcast listener. It's Claire Concannon here with some bonus content just for you. If you've been following the Voice of the CI series, you'll know that the final episode was about combating climate change and both the global and New Zealand efforts to go about this. And for that, I spoke to Eloise Gibson, RNZ's climate correspondent. Now, Eloise is a font of climate change knowledge, and we spoke for over an hour. There was so much interesting stuff in our chat, but unfortunately, I didn't have time for it all in the episode. But I think you might be interested to listen. So here is the full interview. We started by talking about the 2016 Paris Agreement. It's the current global pact built on previous efforts, including the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which committed developed countries to reducing their emissions.
The really important thing that Paris did was to bring in the United States and China, the two biggest emitters on the planet. So under Kyoto, developed countries, OECD countries is a good shorthand way of thinking who's in and who's out. They were meant to do most of the work because they historically had produced most of the emissions and they'd developed their economies on the back of burning fossil fuels. And countries like India and China were saying, well, we're still trying to lift people out of poverty here. We shouldn't be required to make the same level of cuts as those of you who have really got rich off coal and oil. So Paris was critical in that it got those countries in the tent. So India, Brazil, all of these countries without which we cannot solve the climate crisis agreed to take part. The kind of concession, though, was that every country sets its own target. So as long as you can make an argument that what you're doing is consistent with a world that's less than 2 degrees hotter than before we started burning fossil fuels, you can set any target you want. There are rules. There are rules about how you're allowed to measure it. There are rules about having to report back on what you're doing. But every country comes up with what it considers to be its maximum ambition. And that means that there can be very different paths for example, China, which is only committed to peak emissions by 2030, although it will achieve it much sooner than that because renewables are growing at such pace there, or even the UK, which is pledged to cut its emissions by 80% over a really short time frame and has already got coal out of its electricity system, something that even New Zealand hasn't achieved despite starting from a much better place in terms of having highly renewable electricity. So it's kind of everyone contributes what they can or what they say they can based on their national circumstances, but it's meant to be, particularly for developed countries, it's meant to be a stretch goal, hard enough that there is a risk that you'll miss it.
Right, but it's a system that only works if everybody buys in.
Well, that's right. I mean, the common refrain from some in New Zealand is, well, we're such a small part of the emissions picture. Why would we bother? And the answer is that we stand to suffer from climate change, perhaps not quite as badly as Australia, for example, which has, not a lot of water, but pretty badly. I mean, the cost of another Cyclone Gabriel type event has been put at about $14 billion by Treasury, and the risk of it happening in any given year and how severe it will be is affected by global rates of greenhouse gas emissions. We're a country that, in order to make milk, requires on not having too many droughts and having cows that are at a kind of a comfortable temperature and that are living in an environment where grass grows well. All of that is dependent on our climate. And so we stand to suffer as badly as anyone if climate change is left unchecked, but we can't fix it alone. All we can do is our bit, and that is the same for most countries. Most countries only make up a small part of the picture. Each city only makes up a small part of the picture. Individual emitters in countries like China produce much, much less than an individual person in New Zealand. So each part of the whole has to work together in order for it to happen. And so that is where the Paris Accord comes in. It's kind of a way of preventing, short-circuiting this conversation where every single country says, well, China's not doing anything. Well, the US isn't doing anything. Well, why should I do anything? India's not doing anything. That can go around in circles forever unless you have some type of trust-based deal to hold countries accountable. That is what this is supposed to be. The way that that's supposed to be achieved is essentially peer pressure. So each country is meant to be transparent about what they're doing to achieve their targets, how they're tracking, and what kind of policies they have in place. And then the idea is that, civil society and other countries come in and examine that and put pressure on countries that aren't doing their bit.
So something that's legally binding, or there's no big world body that will come and get us if we don't do it. But the things that put pressure on countries are, as you say, our peers. So perhaps international trade agreements?
Well, Claire, I think we should break that statement you just made up. I mean, there are lawyers for climate action, for example, in New Zealand, who've been very successful at making the government overturn decisions in the past that weren't in accord with climate law. They say that Paris does include legally binding commitments and that New Zealand is actually very bound. But also, you're correct to say that, the global police are not going to turn up and knock on Christopher Luxon's door and demand that he sort out his emissions plan from now to 2030. It doesn't work like that. But we are seeing increasing moves by countries that are still moving quickly on climate change to try and get everybody up with their speed. So, for example, yes, it is written into the fair trade agreements with the UK and Europe that both parties will meet their Paris targets. And of course, that leaves New Zealand open to, for example, exporters in those countries who might want to compete with us to say, oh, hey, hang on, I don't think this free trade deal is being adhered to by New Zealand. But also, there are moves by economies that are moving quickly, most notably Europe, to try and get everyone else on the same page. So, for example, there's something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which Europe places on imports of goods to its country if it feels like the country they're coming from isn't pulling its weight. So it's saying to, for example, steel manufacturers in Europe, look, yeah, we have a heavy emissions price on your steel. If you're burning coal to make it, you're gonna pay for that in our economy. So what they do is adjust the price at the border to reflect that. There are murmurings that one day, should it move on farming emissions, that even could apply to New Zealand's farming exports if we don't have a price on emissions from farming at that point. So those who have the clout and who want to move on climate change are increasingly kind of finding ways to try to get everybody to move with them. There's also a bunch of voluntary, you might say, business stuff happening completely independently of what governments are telling companies to do. So, for example, in New Zealand, we don't have a price on the emissions from farming. So, whilst people might say that our efforts to meet our Paris target are crippling farmers, actually at the moment there is no price on the emissions that New Zealand farmers make. There have been discussions of bringing one in, but we have not actually ever done that.
Agriculture continues to be New Zealand's biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. The government's 2022 inventory reported that it made up 53.2% of our emissions. Most of this, over 80%, are methane emissions, mostly burps from cows and sheep. Under our Domestic Climate Change Response Act, New Zealand has a target of reducing these animal-made methane emissions by 10% below 2017 levels by 2030. Right now, our goal for 2050 is to reduce methane emissions by 24 to 47%. But the current government launched a review of this last year, and they're still debating whether to reduce this target. But back to Eloise, who says that outside of government regulations, some businesses are driving change.
Farmers are being offered carrots or incentives, if you like, to lower their emissions by international companies like Mars and Nestle, who say, okay, well, look, the US government may no longer have a binding climate target that it's signed up to, but we still have targets and our customers still expect us to not be making the climate crisis a whole bunch worse with our chocolate bars. We'll pay you a premium if you're doing a good job of that. If you're backsliding, maybe we'll choose someone else. So companies like Fonterra are saying, well, we don't want to be in a race for the cheapest milk powder. We've been trying to do that for a while and it doesn't always work out. That's not a good premium position for our farmers to be in. We're actually better to chase this lower carbon ideal for purely selfish reasons.
When Eloise says the US government doesn't have a target anymore, she is, of course, referring to this.
But I'm immediately withdrawing from the unfair one-sided Paris Climate Accord ripoff.
It will still take 1 year for the US to leave, again joining Iran, Libya and Yemen as the only countries outside the pact.
Trump has pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. How big of an impact is this going to have? Or is the barge already turning? And maybe this will slow the turn, but things are already on track and actually we won't be going back to an age of oil or coal.
Yeah, I think my money's on the second one. I think the barge is already turning and it's pretty hard. Just as it was incredibly hard to turn it the first place, it also takes more than Trump to turn it back the other way. But it doesn't mean it won't cause damage. I mean, the losses to science, crucial climate science, that the rest of the world relies on to, foresee natural disasters. It's going to be really hard for the United States to come back from those cuts to important knowledge. However, last time Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, nobody else left. Nobody else has left this time. And some other countries have doubled down on their efforts and said, look, we will take the leadership mantle from the US since they are not going to do it. We will do it instead. So I don't think it does nothing. I think that words and rhetoric do matter, and I think it may provide cover for others to do a little less. On the other hand, I was talking to somebody who works with a lot of big companies on their environmental and social reporting, and they were saying, yes, some big banks and big institutions withdrew from their own internal climate targets and things like that, or net zero accords in the wake of Trump getting in. But they were saying the money is actually in clean energy and clean action these days. And so they were not foreseeing those companies really changing their perception of, the financial risk associated with climate change and what their customers demanded from them. What they were doing was maybe just taking it down a notch on their website, So they don't want to antagonize the president and his party because that's politically dumb, but it doesn't mean that the overall bulk of their actions are going to be considerably different. So, we'll see, won't we, in 3.5 years' time, but I don't think it's going to bring the whole thing crashing down.
So, under the Paris Agreement, countries set down their own targets for emissions reductions out to 2030, with the idea that all the targets combined would keep us below that 2 degrees of warming from pre-industrial temperatures. But for the peer pressure accountability to work, there has to be clear reporting mechanisms and check-ins.
There is a heck of a lot of rules around what is best practice and how you measure everything and how you count everything. But from a nice succinct perspective, you do need to report back. You need to show that you've done your homework. So even though the assignment may not be due until 2030, you need to show that you're working on it in the meantime. You can't just kind of try and dash it all off the night before. So we've recently had the first 2 yearly, they're called transparency reports under the Paris Agreement. And that is where every country says, okay, this is how we're tracking. This is the target that we set, and this is how we are going so far. And the purpose of that is to demonstrate that you have got the policies and the plans in place inside your own country to meet the target that you've set yourself, rather than just saying, oh, we're going to meet it. We're going to, no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Ask us in 2030. Should be no problem. Because, of course, that raises a very high risk that we will get to 2030. Nobody will have done the work and we will be in serious trouble as a planet. New Zealand's was a curious document in that there were 84 million tonnes of emissions left more or less unaddressed. So New Zealand has a 2-part target. And we always have had. This was true when John Keyes set the first iteration of our target, in 2016, and it was true when Jacinda Ardern's Labour government boosted our target, as did a lot of other developed countries in 2021, in response to reports showing that the promises made just weren't going to get the planet where it needed to go. So everyone was kind of leaned on at the time by particularly the UK, which was leading the climate summit that year, leaned on to put in a better effort, and most countries did, including us. So our current target is tougher. It's a bit deeper than the first one, even though it covers the same period. So we've upped our promise, basically. But both targets, the smaller one and the bigger one for 2030, have always been in two parts. So the idea has been that we would do as much as we could inside New Zealand to get transport emissions down, electricity emissions down, fewer coal boilers, drying milk for export, that type of thing, but that it was just going to be too expensive to make a respectable pledge just with action inside New Zealand. And so as a cheaper way of achieving a target that was going to be acceptable to other countries, we would buy in some help. The expectation was typically that it would be from Asia or the Pacific because those countries are more affordable. It will be a lot cheaper, for example, to retire a coal-fired power station in Indonesia than it would be to try and do it here or in Australia. And so that would be a cheaper way of getting the same benefit for the climate, but costing New Zealand less money, with the idea being that by 2030, we would have made a lot more progress at home, and in the years after that, we'll be able to make all of the effort, here ourselves. So it was kind of a stopgap thing to put in a decent-sized pledge without having to do it all here. The Climate Change Commission has said, look, it would just be an economic shock to try and pivot the economy that quickly because we have just been too slow to start. We're unwilling to really tackle farming emissions in any serious way. And to be fair, it is also a difficult sector to tackle. We already have a lot of renewable energy. Getting rid of Huntly has been delayed time and time again, our one remaining big coal-fired power station. And when it comes to transport, well, look, we're such a skinny, spread-out country. We don't have very good public transport. That's not something we can turn around in, 9 years. For all of these reasons, we decided to buy in some help. What has happened since the election is that the political will to pay for that help seems to no longer be there. Now, some national MPs have made public statements kind of saying, oh, gosh, we're not going to spend that money. They've then been corrected by Simon Watts, our climate change minister, who says, no, look, we are still committed to meeting our target. We don't really want to spend the money, but we recognise that we can't do this without help, whilst always stopping short of firmly saying, yes, we will pay this amount of money to this person. But New Zealand First, openly hostile to that spending. And it's easy to imagine ACT also being hostile, given that they're saying they might campaign the next election at pulling New Zealand out of the Paris Agreement altogether. So we're now left with 4 years before 2030 and no progress on sealing any of these deals, which of course get more expensive the closer to 2030 you get, because if other countries start panicking and realising that they're not going to meet their targets without help, they'll be going to Indonesia and saying, hey, if we help you shut down that coal-fired power station a little faster, can we have those credits? And the longer that goes on, of course, the more you're left with the expensive action. So we're in a real conundrum, and our report was very curious in that it acknowledged that there was an 84 million tonne gap, and it acknowledged that it was not realistic to close that gap with action inside New Zealand. It did not say what the plan was to close it. All it said was that there had been discussions with certain other countries about potential cooperation. Absolutely no details, though. So far, I'm not aware of any pushback by other countries to the vagueness of that statement, but certainly civil society groups in New Zealand were asking questions about this. This is meant to be a transparency report. It's not very transparent.
Do we know approximately how much that might cost?
Some people have made educated guesses. The figure that's often cited is 3 to 23 billion. That's quite a big range. That is the estimate that Treasury made a number of years ago. And the reason that the range was so huge was that it depended on when we made the purchases, whether there was free trading of carbon credits between countries, whether we did one-on-one deals, and who we did them with. So what I have heard from people who know their stuff when it comes to international carbon trading and things like that is that if it costs $23 billion, we've done something wrong. That would mean waiting until the very last minute and doing a deal with Europe, say, for gold-plated carbon credits, which would be crazy because Europe doesn't really need help, for one thing, and it's also very expensive. So if we're snapping up good quality, genuine climate action earlier, it certainly, if we'd already done it, could have been a lot cheaper and probably still could have. So experts I've spoken to have said they think if we do it right, we could get genuine emissions cuts from other countries at the low end of that range, so much, much closer to the $3 billion. It's still a lot of money to spend overseas, and, certainly Winston Peters has been saying that he doesn't support sending billions of dollars overseas, but, when you put it in the context of the aid budget that he oversees as foreign minister, that's about $1.2 billion a year. This would be potentially as little as $3 billion spread over 10 years. So it's a lot of money, but it's not completely out of whack with other things that New Zealand spends money on. Of course, the other option is that we do it all here in New Zealand, but I think that's looking increasingly not feasible and expensive, because even if you plant trees, we could plant a whole bunch of trees today and they wouldn't be sequestering much carbon by 2030. So they're a solution for tomorrow more than they are today.
And so have we done any deals on this overseas so far? I mean, you were saying that this agreement is from John Key era, like 2015/2016, looking out to 2030. Have we done anything on the overseas emissions purchases that we had said we would?
We have done nothing concrete. So you can imagine that in John Key's time, this seemed very distant, right? This was many governments into the future that somebody was going to have to deal with this. New Zealand has always been a strong advocate on the world stage for just opening up global carbon trading. And I think in John Key's time, it was probably hoped that we would have essentially an emissions trading scheme for the world, and we'd just be able to do deals. And it was very uncertain what the cost would be, how many of these we would end up needing. You could probably certainly now argue that it would have been good to get going back then, but you can kind of see why they didn't. And then the can just got kicked further and further out, despite repeated assurances by governments that they were committed to meeting this target. So when James Shaw was the climate change minister previously, officials at the Ministry for the Environment hashed out a set of principles that would determine what would make these carbon savings real. What criteria should they meet? So, for example, is just agreeing not to chop down a forest enough? Probably not. I mean, that's kind of a paper-based carbon saving. Is closing a coal-fired power station enough? Yes, but you probably need to prove that it wasn't going to be closed anyway and that you've done something real for the climate by bringing that date forward. So all of this is quite technical and quite tough, and officials did a whole bunch of work on it, and it looked to me, just from reading various documents released under the Official Information Act and various things that have been proactively released, that we got to the point where we were ready to go out and start bilateral talks with other countries. But that decision required cabinet approval, and that approval has never come. So James Shaw was talking under the previous government of having, done a deal kind of before the last election. That didn't happen. Labor was then voted out. We've now got a new climate change minister and a new cabinet that is significantly less keen on spending money on anything, but particularly sending it overseas. And so it's become a really tricky situation, and the consequences of decisions by every previous government not to seal any deals are starting to be really felt now, because, you might have assumed that we could have signed something right after the election, everything was ready to go, but the spending for that has obviously not been approved.
So that's the overseas component, still up in the air. In terms of what we're doing at home, are we tracking okay on that?
Yes and no. This is a kind of a good news story. The good news is that we're doing much better than we thought we were going to be doing when John Key signed up to our first Paris pledge. So the number of credits that we need to buy from overseas shrinks all the time. So 84 million tonnes is over a year's worth of New Zealand emissions, but it used to be much higher than that. It used to be double that. So we have made some strides on climate action. It hasn't even always been purposeful climate action. Sometimes it's just been pine trees being planted to harvest pine logs. But things are looking slightly better than we thought. The cost of renewable energy comes down all the time, and those kind of forces do help drive change. The thing is that New Zealand's emissions, so the part that we do inside this country is divided into 5-year blocks, and each one has its own emissions budget, which the government has to meet. The first 2 emissions budgets, particularly the first one, they were pretty light. So 2/3 of the work was going to be done overseas and only 1/3 of it in New Zealand. The heavy lifting was always left to be done later, as so often happens with climate action.
Under the Paris Agreement, we submit a target every 5 years, and they should be increasingly ambitious. That initial 2016 target was a 30% reduction of 2005 emissions by 2030, which was upped to 50% in 2021, with that 2-part target, overseas help and work at home. Our freshly submitted 2035 target is 51 to 55%, which has garnered the criticism in some corners of not being super ambitious in terms of upping from 50%. But all of this should be achieved at home. However, with the current policies, we will be a projected 9 million tonnes of emissions over the lower 51% target.
Partly that is a legacy of the coalition having scrapped a bunch of stuff that Labour had instituted that was going to pay off in emissions terms further down the track. And partly it's because it takes time to ramp up to things. So really for long-term changes like the transport sector, you would need to be making change now and investing now to get those benefits post-2030, and that's just not happening. What we're hearing from the government currently is, well, it's a long time between now and then, and we'll be coming up with our plan for that in, 2028. I think what critics would say is a gap of that size is not something you're going to be able to close in 2028 and expect it to be solved between 2030 and 2035, because a lot of this is structural. It's how we do manufacturing. It's how we move around as a country. It's the quality of our public transport networks and our cycling networks, and whether people have rooftop solar, whether the electricity market is set up to incentivise renewables rather than everybody relying on coal at Huntly. And those are big, difficult changes and unlikely to occur if we leave it until 18 months before.
And is this the main thing that climate action just comes up against over and over, that in order to get those real advances on reducing carbon emissions, it requires long-term planning and investment, but you're contrasting that with short-term political terms in office?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Claire. I think it's exactly what you just said, and it's also a perception by politicians that people are unwilling for them to take the steps that they need to take to get where they need to go. So, that yes, people may say that they care about climate change, and they do repeatedly in surveys. They also say that they care about cost of living more than climate change, but actually those two things are fairly compatible. I mean, renewable energy is cheaper. Importing less fossil fuel is cheaper for the country's balance of payments. Earning a premium on your dairy exports from Mars because you lowered your emissions. That's money coming into the country. So I don't think the two things are as opposed as politicians or even people assume that they are, but I think that there's a sense from politicians that even if they want to act, people aren't ready for them to act quickly and that they'll get voted out. And then there's I believe, a really ironic feedback loop, which is that people assume that if it was as much of as an emergency as the scientists say, politicians would be doing something. Well, they wouldn't just let us sit here while we got another Cyclone Gabriel that we didn't need to have, or destroyed the productivity of the primary sector from drought and flood, or, lost billions of dollars worth of coastal property because it can no longer get insurance. Because if it was that serious, people would be doing something. So it kind of becomes a bit of a feedback loop. I mean, we have seen change. The previous government in particular put in place a lot of architecture, a lot of structure around the way we report our emissions, the fact that we have budgets, the fact that we have targets. That was extremely useful, and that has not been repealed by the current government. So that kind of bipartisan commitment to progress, even though it is too slow, is new and it is significant. And it was notably modelled off the United Kingdom, which has probably been one of the most successful developed economies when it comes to getting their emissions down. And although they've gone at different paces under different leaders, they have maintained it even, under both Conservative and Labour governments. So they're a good one to copy. I think what has been different about New Zealand is that in the UK, when the climate change, it's not called the Climate Change Commission over there, I think it's the Climate Change Committee, they have made a hard ruling and said, look, you're not on track, you need to do this, this and this. Governments have seemed to feel more bound there than they have here. They haven't always followed the advice to the letter, but here certainly governments of both stripes have felt very free to ignore unpalatable advice from our own Climate Change Commission. So this whole idea of taking it out of the political sphere and not having it a football and everybody pulling in the same direction hasn't quite come off as successfully here. But we also, we have less money than they do. And perhaps, the architecture hasn't been quite as successful. So, look, things have changed, and I think that steps are being taken, but it seems to be that when governments come up against it, for example, Chris Hipkins, when he thought that emissions prices rising was going to push up petrol prices, he was going for re-election, and he backtracked on what the evidence was clearly telling him needed to happen. That was later overturned in court, incidentally. But, our metal doesn't seem to be particularly tough when it comes to brazening these things out. And perhaps politicians think, well, I'll get back in and then I'll fix it, which doesn't have a great track record of working.
Until I read your analysis, Eloise, I kind of had in my head that things were in hand. Like maybe New Zealand wasn't doing all that it could possibly do. And maybe we didn't have the most ambitious Paris Agreement targets, but that it was happening across the different parties, across different governments that have been in power. New Zealand was moving towards its target. I hadn't realized that there was this whole overseas portion that we hadn't yet invested in. Do you think that there's a lot of the population that are also like me, that are kind of like, well, the government says that they're committed to doing what they said they would for the Paris Agreement, and they have that in hand?
It's not just you, and it's not just the population, it's the politicians themselves. You'll frequently hear party leaders, most recently Christopher Luxon, fudging between the domestic part of the target and the overseas part of the target in a sentence, to an extent that suggests to me that they don't actually understand this very well themselves. So you're very much not alone. And I think a lot of people hear them say we're committed to the target. Whenever I ask Simon Watts about this, he says we're actively considering what we're going to do about that 84 million. And people just assume, well, they'll figure something out. I don't think they perhaps realise how limited the government's options are here. You hear people saying, oh, well, they'll do some type of accounting trick, or they'll start counting forests and fjordland. They may have something up their sleeves that they're planning to try, but the rules of Paris are more prescribed than I think people realise. And I think probably the advice they're getting back on that, if they're getting advice on that, is less helpful or encouraging than they would have hoped. But they're stuck because they're not able to find the political consensus to spend the money to do the things. I do think that if you just look at the New Zealand part of the progress, we are moving. We've turned our emissions around, finally, in the last few years. They've stopped going up or plateauing, and they've started coming down. And that is significant. Other developed countries got there a long time before we did, but we have done it, and that really does count. And you do start to get to the point where momentum from things like solar and batteries being so much cheaper than anybody thought they were going to be, say 10 years ago, those things start to have a momentum of their own, as do demands from our export customers. So you do get to the point where the economics start to drive the transition itself. I think what can happen, though, when it's not well planned is that it's a lot more expensive than it could have been. So, I mean, these carbon offsets are a great example. If we'd been chipping money into a fund to pay for them since 10 years ago and we'd started doing deals, they'd be a heck of a lot cheaper than they will be if we have to buy them in 2030. Likewise, if we had thought about how we were going to get off using so much fossil fuel gas in our economy, we probably would have had a plan for the time when our fossil fuel fields started to run low and companies, manufacturers, employers are just closing because they can't get the energy that they need. If we had had a plan for transitioning to renewable energy that was a lot more proactive, that potentially could have been avoided. So you get a transition that's more chaotic and more expensive, I think, when you don't have some kind of bipartisan plan and proactive planning about how you're going to get there. But it's not to say that we're not getting there. I'm just not sure we're getting there in the most efficient or pain-free way. I mean, by 2030, we will be doing a lot more at home. We're not going to need overseas carbon credits to meet our targets after that. I mean, we're not on target to meet our targets, but we could be. You know, there's lots that we could do now that would make a huge difference. And I think that is really positive. It is really positive to see solutions coming online and things getting more affordable. So I think there is momentum, and I think that momentum to an extent continues regardless of what President Trump does or regardless of what one government does in New Zealand even. I would say, though, that the withdrawal of climate policy under the current coalition government is more marked than we've seen before, partly because there wasn't much policy to go back on under previous governments. So there's more now to undo, but there has been a mass undoing, often in the face of official advice, even economic-based advice. And so that is a step backwards, and future governments are going to have to fill that gap, which may end up costing more.
You mentioned a few things there in terms of that momentum. Do we see that in the global picture? Is that something that is starting to happen? Like that shift in terms of the money, really, I guess, is the thing that needs to happen, right?
Yeah. And I'm mainly meaning globally when I talk about momentum. It's just that it will sweep New Zealand along to some extent. The real movers and shakers here have always been the insurance companies. They have increasingly started to say, look, governments, if you don't take steps to future-proof your coastal communities, we're just not going to insure them. We're seeing insurance retreat in increasingly fire-prone parts of the United States. And those things drive up people's costs, and they do create pressure for action, but they also shift the flow of money. So, you know, you see banks, for what they say are purely commercial, you know, not kind of virtual signaling reasons, withdrawing from heavily fossil fuel-based industries if those industries don't have a plan to transition to something cleaner or to do something more resilient. The theory has always been that that drives up the cost of borrowing and the cost of getting investment for high-emitting industries and makes it cheaper for everybody else, because these big financial institutions see the dirtier option as the more expensive and the more high-risk one, and therefore it actually can be easier to win investment for example, a new solar farm or something like that. I mean, that hasn't happened as tidily as, you know, economic theory would suggest, partly because there hasn't always been transparency of information about exactly what those risks were. Companies weren't always required to disclose how at risk they might be from climate change, but that's really changing. So New Zealand had the first climate disclosure regulations in the world that required share market listed companies and some others to disclose the risks that climate change poses to their business. And lots of other countries, Australia, the UK, all over the world, now have even stricter versions of those than we do. And that should, in theory, channel the money towards cleaner and more climate resilient options. So there's momentum in that sense. And there's also something I think I've alluded to a couple of times, which is just that the cleaner options have become cheaper faster than analysts thought. So, China just absolutely pumping out affordable solar panels and, affordable electric vehicles and undercutting everybody else. Of course, manufacturing things in China is not always particularly environmentally friendly or low carbon itself, but because they're also decarbonising the electricity grid so quickly, that will change. They're still burning a lot of coal at the moment, but because it's becoming more expensive for them, and they're importing their coal from countries like Australia that they have sometimes quite tense relationships with, if they're trying to make their domestic economy as kind of self-contained as it possibly can be, that means burning less coal, burning less fossil fuel, because that's all imported stuff. And it's up to the whims of other countries, how to price it and how much to supply. So there is momentum. And I think actually momentum in the private sector has probably surprised me personally on the upside, and momentum from governments has probably surprised me personally on the downside.
These are the big players that should be implementing the changes we need to reduce global emissions: businesses and governments. In survey after survey about climate change in New Zealand, the vast majority of us respond that we are concerned about it and want to see action. So I asked Eloise what kind of things we can do, both individually and also collectively as citizens, to affect change.
People who crunch household emissions say that transport is our biggest impact, diet is second. In New Zealand, electricity's relatively small, our electricity sector's pretty clean on the whole. So those are the areas where I think they would say you should target your effort. It's really important to note, though, that this isn't anyone's personal problem to solve. I mean, I hate the idea that a child of 10 will be stressing out over the dinner table that they need to solve climate change, because of course they don't. Not only is this a problem for adults, it's a problem for governments. And, companies and governments know what is at stake here. I think what we can do is let them know that we want them to do it. One way is to use public transport, use cycle lanes, take small trips out of the car if you can. It's also really good for you to do that. But don't feel that, you need to go and put your car on the scrap heap and then you can't drive your elderly mum to hospital, because that's what's required for the climate crisis. I think the important thing is to signal that you're ready to do these things, that you'll do what can work with your lifestyle. Likewise, you might decide to eat beef a little bit less often. It's the most climate intensive type of food, but it's also really delicious and I still eat it. And often it will save you money. So there's some really compelling case studies now about electrifying your vehicle and your house and what that can save you in terms of your bills. It doesn't stack up for every single person, but there's so many people that it does save money for. So I think that's really important. One other thing is to look at your investments. So KiwiSaver providers vary hugely in where they invest their money and how much they care about whether or not they are worsening the climate crisis or not. It's really easy to find out information about that. And that's where a lot of people's money, any money they have that's not in their house, that's often where it is for a New Zealander. I think spending power is the other thing that we maybe don't talk about enough. I mean, look at the impact that whoever buys from Nestle and Mars globally is having on New Zealand farmers who are now being paid if they want to reduce their emissions. That is, 50% of New Zealand's emissions being impacted on what people who go to supermarkets overseas demand and what they want. I've seen Silver Fern Farms, one of our big meat exporters, get themselves on the shelves at Waitrose recently because they had what Waitrose thought was a solid plan to cut their emissions. It was hard for them to do, I've heard. It wasn't actually easy to get that ticked off and to make it meet, very scientific criteria. But if you think about it, those people going into the supermarket in the UK who've got the wherewithal to think about it and to make a choice, they're saying, well, you know what, I do still want to eat a little bit of steak, but I'd quite like to do it from a company that's making the problem a bit better rather than a bit worse. So I think there's lots to do. I think writing to local councillors and MPs is really important. And I think just sticking up for things like, perhaps a safe zone outside your local school for where children can ride or cycle safely so that their parents don't feel that they need to get in the car and drive them to avoid them getting squished. I think things like that have so many benefits for clean air and communities and costs and quality of life that it's almost worth it even taking climate change out of the equation. But once you add in the climate layer, they make lots of sense. It can be really hard to find the energy in your life. I know I find it hard to do extra things, but I think individuals picking one thing and then really carefully considering when they vote as well. Who's doing what are they on track for? Does this match my vision for the future? Does this match where I think New Zealand should be positioning itself? And kind of can they show their workings? Does this all add up? It's a lot to take in, but I think that a lot of really high emissions industries and a lot of politicians rely on the fact that people don't have the bandwidth to grapple with it. And so a tiny bit of effort there, I think, makes a really big difference. Just being curious and engaged.
And a big thanks to RNZ's climate correspondent, Eloise Gibson. Eloise has continued her excellent reporting on all the recent developments around New Zealand's international and domestic climate change commitments. If you check out the show notes for this bonus episode, you'll find links to her recent articles there. Sound engineering was by Steve Burridge. I'm Claire Concannon. Mā te wā.